On March 28, 2023, Ryuichi Sakamoto died, but the first feeling his death left behind was not noise. It was silence. The kind of silence that feels heavier because the person who is gone spent an entire lifetime teaching the world how to listen more carefully. By the time the news was made public a few days later, his family had already held a private funeral. That detail alone says almost everything about the way this story begins. There was no giant public spectacle, no chaotic final scandal, no loud collapse in front of cameras. There was only a quiet ending, almost painfully restrained, to the life of a man whose music had traveled through film, electronics, classical composition, activism, and grief itself. The world did not lose just a composer. It lost a mind that had spent decades turning feeling into sound with a kind of precision that very few artists ever reach. And yet what makes the opening of his story so haunting is not simply that he died. It is that he had already been living beside death for years. He had faced throat cancer. Then came rectal cancer. Then came the colder truth. He knew time had changed, that the body was no longer something he could trust in the same way. But even after that, the music did not stop. He kept writing, recording, reflecting, and shaping sound, as though work itself had become a way of measuring how much life still remained inside him. That is why the beginning of this script cannot be built like ordinary tragedy. Ryuichi Sakamoto was not a man destroyed in public. He was a man who moved toward the end with devastating awareness. In interviews from his later years, there was no fantasy left that art could make him immortal in the childish sense. He knew what illness was doing. He knew the body was closing in. But what makes him so emotionally overwhelming to look back on now is that he did not respond to that knowledge by retreating into silence. He responded by making silence itself speak. The final image of him that lingers most strongly is not tabloid grief or sensational collapse. It is a frail man at the piano, stripped of excess, facing the instrument almost like a witness facing his own life. That is why his last period feels less like a decline than a final movement in a composition he was still shaping with full consciousness. He was dying, and still he was arranging sound, still thinking, still listening, still leaving behind pieces of himself in tones the world would only fully understand after he was gone. And maybe that is the cruelest beauty in Ryuichi Sakamoto's ending. He did not vanish in chaos. He vanished in control, with terrible grace, and with the kind of sadness that becomes even harder to bear because it never once needed to shout. Before we go back to the restless young mind in Tokyo, before Yellow Magic Orchestra, before the Oscars and the films and the legend, we begin here, with a man sitting close to death, still making music as if he understood that the last thing he could leave the world was not explanation, but sound. Long before Ryuichi Sakamoto became the kind of artist whose name could move between concert halls, cinema, and electronic music history with effortless authority, he was a young mind already leaning away from the ordinary. He was born in Tokyo in 1952, in a Japan still rebuilding itself, and grew up surrounded by a culture that carried both discipline and fracture in equal measure. He began studying piano early, but the important thing about his youth was never that he learned an instrument young. Many children do that. What made Sakamoto different was the way he listened. Even before fame, he seemed drawn less to rules than to possibility. Classical music was there, of course, but so were sounds from elsewhere. Debussy, avant-garde ideas, jazz, the unsettling beauty of music that did not behave politely. By the time he was old enough to think seriously about art, he was already turning toward a wider world than the one he had been handed. That is the emotional key to his youth. Ryuichi Sakamoto was not built to remain inside one tradition for very long. He was already the kind of person who heard borders as things meant to be crossed, not obeyed. That impulse only deepened when he entered Tokyo University of the Arts, where he studied composition and developed a serious interest in ethnomusicology. This is where the early image of Sakamoto becomes more useful than a childhood scrapbook ever could. He was no longer just a talented student at a piano. He was becoming a thinker, someone trying to understand how music could hold modernity, memory, politics, technology, and beauty all at once. The young Sakamoto was restless in the most important sense. He did not want to inherit sound. He wanted to remake it. That is why the years before fame matter so much in a script like this. They explain the adult artist before he becomes famous enough to look inevitable. The world later saw an elegant, composed, globally admired figure who seemed born to become a legend. But in these earlier years, what existed first was hunger. Hunger to experiment, hunger to challenge form, hunger to pull Japanese music into conversation with the wider world without making it smaller in the process. Before the awards, before Yellow Magic Orchestra, before film scores and late-life fragility, There was a brilliant young man in Tokyo, absorbing everything, resisting simplicity, and moving steadily toward the sound of the future without yet knowing he would help invent it. By the late 1970s, Ryuichi Sakamoto was no longer just a brilliant young composer with unusual taste and a restless mind. He was becoming one of the people who would change how the future sounded. In 1978, together with Haruomi Hosono and Yukihiro Takahashi, he formed Yellow Magic Orchestra, and from that point forward, his name began moving far beyond the traditional space of a Japanese classical student or avant-garde experimenter. YMO did not simply make catchy electronic music. The group helped reshape what electronic pop could feel like. Sleek but playful, mechanical but emotional, futuristic without losing irony or intelligence. Their sound traveled outward into synth pop, techno, hip-hop production, gaming culture, and electronic music more broadly, leaving behind an influence that far exceeded the charts of the moment. Around the same time, Sakamoto's solo work made something equally clear. He was too expansive to remain inside one group or one genre. His early solo material fused electronic experimentation, traditional Japanese textures, and a composer's instinct for architecture, creating music that sounded both intellectual and strangely intimate. This is the point in his story where the public image begins to change. The young man from Tokyo, who had once been defined by curiosity alone, was now becoming a global artistic force. He was not merely following trends in sound, he was helping invent the language other artists would later inherit. Japan Society describes him as a founding member of Yellow Magic Orchestra and notes that he went on to score more than 30 films, while the group's own historical significance is widely tied to their pioneering role in popular electronic music. But what made Sakamoto's rise so extraordinary was that he never allowed success to flatten him into one identity. He could have remained only a pop innovator and still secured his place in music history. Instead, he moved into film composition and expanded again, proving that his gift was not just for sound design or trend setting, but for emotional depth on an entirely different scale. Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence became an early turning point, not only because he composed for it, but because he also acted in it, giving the world a rare glimpse of how fully music and image coexisted inside him. Then came The Last Emperor, the score that brought him the Academy Award and fixed his global stature in another realm entirely. By this point, Ryuichi Sakamoto was no longer only a Japanese musician admired abroad. He had become something harder to summarize. A composer who could move between electronic innovation, modern classical writing, film emotion, and conceptual artistry without ever seeming divided by those categories. That is why this part of the story matters so much. Before illness, before the late-life quiet, before the final piano and the private funeral, there was this astonishing period when Sakamoto seemed almost impossible to contain. He was elegant, but never safe, sophisticated, but never sterile, experimental, but never emotionally empty. The world did not just admire him because he was talented. It admired him because he kept proving that intelligence and feeling did not have to be separated in art. And maybe that is why his later death felt like the silencing of something larger than a person. In his prime, Ryuichi Sakamoto did not merely create music. He altered the emotional vocabulary through which modern audiences experienced the future, memory, cinema, and beauty itself. The Guardian and the Academy both note the breadth of that achievement, from Yellow Magic Orchestra to his Oscar-winning work on The Last Emperor. What made Ryuichi Sakamoto's final years so devastating was not simply that he was ill. Many great artists become sick, disappear for a while, and then return, or fade quietly from view. Sakamoto's story was harder to watch because the body and the mind seemed to be moving in opposite directions. Physically, he was becoming more fragile. Publicly, he admitted he had undergone treatment for throat cancer and later revealed that he was living with stage 4 rectal cancer. But artistically, something in him remained unbearably alert. The Guardian noted that even after decades of acclaim, he never stopped being a restless traveler musically, someone who resisted staying inside one finished identity. That is what gives this chapter its emotional force. He was not a man clinging to a past version of himself while the body declined. He was still searching, still listening, still composing, still trying to shape something true from the narrowing space he had left. That is a much more painful kind of courage. It is one thing to create while life feels open. It is another to keep creating while fully aware that time is closing around you. And Sakamoto seemed to understand that with terrible clarity. The same artist who had spent decades expanding the vocabulary of electronic music, film score, and modern composition now had to face the oldest and most humiliating limit of all. The body does not care how brilliant the mind still is. It breaks anyway. But the extraordinary thing about Sakamoto is that he did not turn that confrontation into melodrama. He did not make illness the whole meaning of his final period. Instead, he folded it into the work. The Guardian describes him as a lifelong restless traveler, and that restlessness remained visible even near the end. The difference was that, by then, the movement was no longer outward into fame, fashion, or reinvention. It was inward. He had reached a point where almost everything unnecessary had been stripped away. That is why the final image of him at the piano feels so powerful. There is no excess left in it. No youth, no glamour, no elaborate mythology of the genius at full strength. Only a thin, aging, very mortal man, and the instrument that had been with him for so much of his life. That is where this story becomes almost unbearable. The world was still receiving music from him, still receiving thought and form and emotional precision, while the body producing those things was already moving toward the end. In some artists, late work feels nostalgic. In Sakamoto, it feels exposed. There is a vulnerability in it that cannot be separated from illness, not because the work is weak, but because it sounds like someone choosing not to hide from the truth anymore. He had already proven everything he needed to prove. He had the Oscar, the global legacy, the historical importance, the admiration of multiple generations. What remained was something much rarer, the willingness to sit with finitude and still make beauty from it. And maybe that is the darkest and most moving part of his story. Ryuichi Sakamoto was not defeated in spirit before the end. He was defeated physically, little by little, while the mind kept trying to turn what was left of life into one more piece of music, one more gesture of listening, one more act of attention. That is why this chapter matters so much. It shows that the real tragedy was never only that he died of cancer. It was that even while dying, he remained fully himself, and that made losing him feel less like the end of a career than the silencing of a consciousness that had never stopped reaching for sound. When the world finally learned that Ryuichi Sakamoto had died, the loss arrived already wrapped in distance. His family announced that he had passed away on March 28, 2023, but the news was only made public on April 2nd, after a private funeral had already been held. That delay gave his death a strange emotional texture. It did not explode into public mourning in real time. It seemed to surface from silence, as if the world had been grieving him a few days late without knowing it. And that lateness fits him. Even at the end, Sakamoto's departure refused spectacle. There was no grand public ceremony, no giant final image for the cameras to consume. Instead, there was a private farewell, and later, an almost unbearably intimate revelation. His management shared a playlist he had been quietly compiling to be played at his own funeral. That detail changes everything. It means his final goodbye was not only marked by music, it was curated by him, patiently, consciously, while he was still alive and still listening. The artist who had spent decades scoring cinema, reinventing electronic music, and turning grief into sound, had also chosen the soundscape for his own ending. Few details could be more fitting or more devastating. It turns death into one final act of authorship, and it leaves behind a closing image unlike the endings of most public figures. Not a scandal, not a collapse, but a man who understood the shape of his own disappearance well enough to compose the atmosphere around it. That is why Sakamoto's death still feels so unusually painful. He did not merely leave music behind for the world. He left music behind to carry the world through his absence. What remains after someone like Ryuichi Sakamoto is not emptiness in the ordinary sense. It is a change in how silence itself feels. His work was always about more than melody. It was about texture, decay, distance, memory, and the emotional architecture hidden inside a single tone. That is why his absence sounds different from the absence of other great artists. When people return to Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, The Last Emperor, YMO, the late solo records, or the stripped-down stillness of Opus, they are not only revisiting a catalog, they are hearing the outline of a consciousness that kept searching to the end. Even the Guardian's account of the mixed reality tribute Kagami emphasizes that in his final years, he was still working, still shaping new music, still turning life into one more form of listening. That may be the real legacy this script should end on. Ryuichi Sakamoto did not leave the world as a figure frozen in one era or one style. He left it as a restless intelligence that never stopped trying to hear more. And maybe that is why, after his death, the silence sounds different. Not because the world became empty, but because one of the people who taught it how to hear beauty inside uncertainty was no longer there to listen with it. In the end, Ryuichi Sakamoto was not only a composer who died, he was a man who turned even his ending into an act of attention. And that is why the grief he leaves behind does not feel loud. It feels precise, elegant, and almost impossible to escape, like a note still hanging in the air after the piano has already gone still.